Okay, for you, our listener, we're diving straight into a situation that's been, well, pretty intense and fast-moving in Los Angeles over the past few days.
Yeah, definitely intense. It involves some significant immigration enforcement actions.
Right, and public protests, too. Protests that actually drew different descriptions, didn't they, depending on who was reporting.
Exactly. And then there's this truly notable federal response. We're talking National Guard deployment.
So we've taken this stack of information, and it's primarily drawn from live updates reported by CNN. It covers what unfolded from Friday through Saturday and into Sunday morning.
And our mission here in this deep dive is really to try and cut through the noise, pinpoint the core facts presented in this material.
Understand the different angles, the perspectives reported.
Yeah, and help you get, a clear picture of what's most important about this really complex story.
And we should add a note here. The sources we're working with, they do contain politically charged content.
Absolutely. So it's crucial to state up front, our role is simply to report what these sources tell us. We present the information, the different viewpoints we found within them.
But we are absolutely not endorsing or taking sides on any political position. We're just, laying out the details as they've been reported in the material you shared.
Just the facts as presented in the sources.
Okay, let's unpack this then. What kicked this whole thing off, according to the reports?
Well, based on the source material, the spark for these events was a series of immigration raids that began across the Los Angeles area on Friday.
And what did the reports indicate about the immediate impact of those raids?
The material we reviewed reports that dozens of people were detained by federal immigration agents. This was in various locations on Friday alone.
Dozens, okay.
And then a later report mentioned that around 150 undocumented immigrants had been detained over the first 2 days, so Friday and Saturday.
Right, 150. And the sources frame this happening amid President Trump's broader push on immigration enforcement.
That context is definitely present in the material, yeah. It's mentioned as the backdrop.
So you have these initial raids and detentions reported, and the sources quickly pivot to the public reaction. What did the material reveal about that?
The reports describe protests erupting almost immediately in response to these raids.
Right away.
Seems like it. These demonstrations continued for 2 days, Friday and Saturday, in and around Los Angeles. Some protesters gathered near an immigration holding center in Alameda late on Saturday night.
Okay, now this is where it gets interesting, because the sources present slightly different descriptions of the protests, right?
Yeah.
Depending on which agency is cited.
Exactly, and this is fascinating. For instance, the Los Angeles Police Department, the LAPD, they stated that the protests, specifically in the city of Los Angeles on Saturday night, were peaceful.
Peaceful.
And wrapped up without incident. They said they were prepared for unrest, but none occurred within their specific jurisdiction that night.
But then you have reports from other agencies covering areas right nearby, but technically outside the LAPD's turf.
Yes, exactly. The Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, the LASD, and also reports focusing on the city of Paramount, which is in LA County but outside the city limits. They described a different scene.
What did they say?
They reported violent behavior towards federal agents and deputy sheriffs by protesters there in Paramount on Saturday.
And the sources give some specifics, some vivid details about what happened there.
They do. Tear gas and flashbangs were reportedly used to disperse crowds there. The material also reports protesters threw objects, fireworks, and even set a car on fire in the Paramount Compton area on Saturday night.
Wow, okay. So a very different picture depending on the location and maybe the time. Seems like different groups might have been involved too. The sources mention a comment from Representative Nanette Berrigan.
Yeah, she reportedly made a point of distinguishing. She said the initial peaceful immigration protesters had actually left by Saturday night.
Wow.
She referred to the later group causing violence in Compton as unruly folks that Saturday night crowd. But she did agree, according to the source, that violent individuals should be arrested and prosecuted.
Okay, so you have the raids, the protests with these different reported characteristics, and then the material reveals a pretty significant escalation. What was that?
Well, on Saturday evening, President Trump signed a presidential memorandum, and this ordered the deployment of 2,000 National Guardsmen to Los Angeles.
2,000, specifically to disperse the protests.
That's what the memo ordered, yes.
And the sources include his direct quoted reason for doing this.
They do. He claimed local officials had failed and stated that the federal government would solve the problem riots and looters the way it should be solved. All caps in the quote.
Right. But what did the sources say about the actual boots on the ground by Sunday morning? Was it the full 2,000 right away?
No, that's correct. The initial report wasn't the full number. The material states that about 300 members of the California National Guard were deployed between 2:00 a.m. and 4:00 a.m. Sunday.
300 deployed initially.
At 3 sites around Los Angeles.
And who confirmed this deployment in the sources? How do we know this happened?
Both the California Governor's Office, through a spokesperson named Izzy Garden, and the U.S. Northern Command, NORTHCOM, confirmed it. NORTHCOM used social media.
Okay.
And NORTHCOM specifically mentioned, according to the source, that the California 79th Infantry Brigade combat team was on the ground.
Got it. So confirmation from both state and federal military sources. Now, naturally, this federal action drew some strong reactions from state and local officials. What did the sources report about Governor Newsom's stance?
Governor Gavin Newsom reportedly called the deployment purposefully inflammatory on Saturday night. He warned it would only escalate tensions.
Inflammatory. And the sources mentioned communication happening between the governor and the president about all this.
Yes, the material indicates Governor Newsom actually called President Trump on Friday. This was after the raids had begun.
Okay, after the initial trigger.
Right, and they spoke for approximately 40 minutes, according to the governor's office.
The sources also include a comment from the LA mayor, Karen Bass. What was that about?
Well, May Bass reportedly said there was no evidence of the National Guard on the ground. This was despite President Trump's praise for the deployment.
That seems contradictory to the other reports confirming the Guard's presence.
It does. And it's worth noting, as the source itself points out, that this statement appears to contradict those other reports within the material. That discrepancy is reported right there in the sources we reviewed.
Interesting. So, how did the Trump administration justify the deployment and the overall federal action? What was their reasoning, according to the sources?
According to the sources, DHS Secretary Kristi Noem stated that the National Guard is there to maintain peace and provide security for operations, basically ensuring peaceful protests.
Maintain peace.
She also mentioned that the 2,000 soldiers ordered are specifically trained for crowd situations.
And she didn't hold back on criticizing local officials, did she?
Yeah.
According to the sources.
No, she didn't. Noem reportedly criticized Governor Newsom, Mayor Bass, and the LAPD for their response. She said, "We're not going to let a repeat of 2020 happen," referencing the Black Lives Matter protests.
Wow. Okay. Direct reference there.
Yeah. And when asked about claims of poor conditions in some makeshift facilities, she didn't directly address it, but mentioned challenges getting people in and out because of the violence reported nearby.
The FBI also weighed in, didn't they?
Yeah.
According to the source.
It did. Deputy FBI Director Dan Bongino reportedly stated that multiple people had been arrested, both in LA and New York, for obstructing these enforcement activities, and they would face charges.
Okay.
And he issued a warning to anyone choosing violence, saying, quote, "It will not end well for you."
Strong words. The sources also include some pretty controversial statements and actions surrounding these events that are worth highlighting.
Right.
Let's start with the remarks attributed to border czar Tom Homan.
Right, reported by NBC News, Homan reportedly said that local California officials, including Governor Newsom and Mayor Bass, could potentially be arrested.
Arrested? For what?
If they impede the federal operation or harbor undocumented immigrants, he called it a felony, and explicitly accused them of creating a sanctuary for criminals.
Quite a statement.
Yeah.
And how did the LAPD respond to criticism leveled against them, specifically from the ACLU mentioned in the material?
The LAPD, according to the sources, strongly denied the ACLU's claim that their officers assisted federal agents in terrorizing LA neighborhoods. They called that claim inflammatory and demonstrably false.
Okay, a flat denial.
Yeah. They stated that the LAPD does not participate in immigration enforcement operations and wasn't alerted in advance of the federal activity.
So what was their stated role then? If they weren't assisting enforcement, what did they say they were doing, according to the sources?
The LAPD said their role was limited, solely responding to federal requests to ensure public safety and restore order. Critically, not to support immigration enforcement.
Got it. Public safety, not enforcement support.
Right. They denied impeding access to work, court, or events, and stated they will always respond to requests for assistance from any other law enforcement agency, local, state, or federal, when it involves public safety.
Representative Barragan also shared her expectation about the federal presence in California. based on what she's hearing.
Yes, she stated in the material that she's been told to prepare for 30 days of ICE enforcement. That's Immigration and Customs Enforcement in California.
30 days?
Yeah, and she viewed the National Guard presence as an unwanted escalation that she believes will just make things worse.
And there was President Trump's social media post about masks at protests. That was reported in the sources, too.
Early Sunday, according to the material, he posted that masks will not be allowed at protests. He asked, what do these people have to hide and why?
Interesting.
And the sources point out, interestingly, that ICE officers themselves are allowed to wear masks. The agency's acting director cited family protection as a reason, so that juxtaposition is right there in the reports.
Okay. The sources also bring in perspectives from immigrant rights groups, which offer a different angle on all this.
Yes, absolutely. Groups like the Fair Immigration Reform Movement, they strongly condemned the administration's actions. They characterized them as an authoritarian and violent campaign.
Strong language?
Very. They called the escalation by federal authorities the real crisis and felt the effort to shift blame onto communities was unfair. Angelical Salas from the group described those impacted not as criminals, but as workers, neighbors, students, parents who contribute to California.
And there was another voice cited from that movement.
Yes, Minority Leader. He reportedly called President Trump's action an all-out war against our communities and our democracy. He called it a terrifying threat to use military force against lawful protesters that he said incites fear and chaos.
So very strong condemnation there. The League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, also commented in the sources.
They did. They condemned President Trump's order as a deeply troubling escalation and also criticized the use of what they called military-style tactics.
Now, to put this into some historical context, the sources draw comparisons for this National Guard deployment. And it highlights something pretty significant, doesn't it?
It really does. This specific action, where a U.S. chief executive federally mobilized the National Guard to quell protests.
Meaning ordered them into federal service directly, overriding the state governor's authority.
Exactly. That's significant because the sources state it's the first time it's happened since the 1992 LA riots, the ones after the Rodney King verdict.
1992. And there's a crucial difference highlighted in the sources between that event and now, right?
A key difference. In 1992, the National Guard mobilization was requested by the then California Governor Pete Wilson.
Ah, requested by the state.
Yes. The sources emphasize that the current 2025 deployment was ordered by President Trump despite Governor Newsom's stated opposition. That difference in state versus federal initiative is a really key point from the material.
That's a major distinction. The sources also list other historical instances of federalization of the National Guard, just to give more context.
Yeah, they mention things like using the Guard to support desegregation efforts in the South back in the 50s and 60s, Little Rock in 57, Ole Miss 62, Alabama 63.
Times of major national crisis or resistance to federal law.
Precisely, where state action was deemed insufficient or, actively opposed federal mandates. They also cite restoring order during the Detroit riots in 67, responding to the Martin Luther King Jr. assassination in 68, and even the New York postal strike in 1970.
And they briefly touch on the origin and the largest instance.
Right. The authority itself was first granted by Congress way back in 1792. And the biggest instance mentioned was President Lincoln calling up 75,000 troops during the Civil War.
It's also worth noting, according to the sources, the comparison to the more recent 2020 George Floyd protests. Because the Guard was used then too, wasn't it?
It was, yes. The National Guard was deployed in Los Angeles then. But the sources clarified that deployment was done at Governor Newsom's request.
Okay, so requested by the state again.
Exactly. Not federally ordered by President Trump against the state's wishes, unlike the current situation described in the sources, so even recent history shows a different dynamic at play.
That's really important context. Now, to add another really interesting layer, the sources include findings from a recent poll. Gives us a snapshot of public opinion just before these major LA events kicked off.
Yeah, a CBS News YouGov poll conducted June 4th to 6th, so just before this weekend, stated margin of error is plus minus 2.4 percentage points.
Okay. What were the key takeaways from that poll in the source material regarding this whole topic of deportation?
Well, it found something quite interesting. Americans apparently largely approve of the goals of President Trump's deportation program. That was 55% liking the goals.
Okay, support for the goals.
But they largely dislike the approach he is taking. 56% dislike the approach. So a real split there between the what and the how, you could say, based on these numbers.
That's a fascinating split. Any other notable findings from the poll mentioned in the source?
Yeah, a few things. 53% said they felt the administration is prioritizing dangerous criminals for deportation. A plurality, 42%, felt these efforts make the U.S. safer, versus 30% who felt they make it less safe, and 27% saying no impact. Regarding the economy, more people, 39%, felt the efforts make it weaker than stronger, which was 32%.
Okay, so mixed views on impact.
And this one stood out. A significant majority, 63%, said the administration should first get a U.S. court hearing or other U.S. legal process before deporting a non-citizen.
So a strong preference for legal process first.
Seems so, based on that poll result reported in the source.
And the source briefly mentions President Trump's overall approval rating in this poll's trend.
Yeah, just notes it was holding steady at 45% approve, 55% disapprove.
Okay. Finally, the sources mentioned one other piece of information about President Trump's activities that weekend. Anything relevant?
Just briefly mentioned he was expected to meet with senior administration officials, listed VP Vance, Secretary of State Rubio, Secretary of Defense Hegseth at Camp David on Sunday for a regular retreat on various issues.
Got it. So when you look at all this information from the sources together, wow, what truly stands out are several key tensions and dynamics at play here, aren't there?
Absolutely. You have this very strong federal push for immigration enforcement,
Met with significant local opposition and these public protests.
which then escalated pretty rapidly to this very rare federal deployment of the National Guard. And rare specifically because, as the sources highlight with those historical comparisons,
He was ordered by the president despite the state governor's opposition.
exactly, a dynamic the sources say we haven't seen since 1992, and one that's different even from the Guard use in 2020.
And we also see these conflicting accounts reported about the nature of the protests themselves. Peaceful in the city, according to LAPD.
But violent reported in the county by LASD and others, and some reports even distinguishing between different groups involved at different times. It's messy.
Yeah, and underpinning some of this, you have that poll data suggesting public sentiment is really quite nuanced. Support for the idea of enforcement.
But significant dislike for the method being used, according to the poll. Plus that preference for legal process. It suggests maybe not just differing viewpoints, but potentially different realities playing out simultaneously on the ground, in adjacent areas, and also within public perception.
So when you look at all these pieces together, from the sources you've got, the raids, the protests, the federal military deployment, the sharply contrasting political reactions, those echoes of history where federal power overrode state authority, that snapshot of public opinion, it really does paint a complex and layered picture of conflict and governance right now.
Definitely complex.
So here's something for you, our listener, to think about. Given all these different perspectives presented and the historical context we found in these sources, what does this situation in Los Angeles tell you about the current dynamics playing out between federal authority, state and local governance, and public dissent in the U.S. today?
And maybe what might be the potential implications of these different approaches we're seeing, approaches to managing conflict, approaches to enforcement. What could that mean going forward? Something to really mull over based on the material we've just explored.